Welcome to the Legal Academy, episode 10. I'm your host, Orin Kerr. My guest this week is Emma Kaufman, assistant professor of law at NYU, about to start her second year in the Legal Academy. Emma did her undergraduate degree at Columbia and then was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, where she had her MPhil in 2010 and then received a DPhil in 2012. She then went to law school at Yale, clerked on the Southern District of New York, and then for Judge Tatel on the DC Circuit, was then a Bigelow Fellow at the University of Chicago, and then became an assistant professor at NYU in 2019. Emma's the author of a book, Punish and Expel, Border Control, Nationalism, and the New Purpose of the Prison, which came out in Oxford University Press in 2015. And she has the quite impressive distinction of having back-to-back Harvard Law Review articles, Segregation by Citizenship, which came out last year, which was absolutely terrific, and a forthcoming article as well, The Prisoner Trade in 2020. Emma, I'm really, really happy to have you on the show.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, great. So I wanted to start. I was really excited to have you here, and one of the things that's great is that everybody else I've talked to so far has been a senior scholar, folks that have been teaching typically for 30 years or 40 years. And so a lot of what we've ended up talking about on the show has been sort of perspectives of law professors at various stages of their career. And when those of us who've been doing this for a long time are sort of speculating about what life is like for those starting off, we're speculating. And so I'm just excited to be able to get into some of the issues of how things work and look from the perspective sort of early in your career. And I wanted to start with the question of fellowships and VAPPs. You were a Bigelow Fellow at the University of Chicago, one of the top VAPP fellowship programs, certainly. And there's a lot of discussion among professors about the role of VAPPs and what they do. Are they really just about credentialing? Are they about giving somebody time to write? I was hoping you could offer your take on the role both of VAPPs generally and also maybe even the Bigelow program specifically.
Yeah, sure. So I'll sort of say two things. One is that my sense of the academy, with the caveat that basically everything I say might change under pandemic conditions, but my sense of the academy generally is that VAPPs are becoming more and more common as a kind of precursor to entry into the academy. So at the time that I had finished my clerkships, I fancied myself to be someone who could have gone onto the market and decided to do a VAPP. I was sort of at this turning point and decided to do a fellowship because I was risk averse and I thought, more time is better. And I'm really, really glad I did, both because I think it's sort of slowly becoming a prerequisite to entry into the profession, but also because I think it is an incredibly important learning experience and opportunity. I sort of tell everyone who can, I should say, you have to be willing to move to where it is and to afford the pay that comes with a fellowship as opposed to a permanent job. So assuming that that's possible, and that can have disparate effects on people, if you can do it, I say do it. And I think there's two things it offers. So one is time to write, if you haven't written, and also time to go on the market. So in the pre-pandemic, you fly everywhere for your job interviews era, it's an incredibly time-consuming thing to go on the market. The thing I typically tell people is that when I was on the market between August and December, I wasn't home in my house for more than like 2 or 3 nights in a row in that whole time period. So having a job where it's not like a secret that you're interviewing for other jobs and that can support you through it is sort of essential to getting into the profession and being able, if you really want to go on and see the sort of full range of schools. So one part is just like, it sets you up to do the going on the job market thing with your paper and the flying and all of that. But maybe more importantly, I, despite having done lots of sort of academic things, didn't know what it meant to be a legal academic and to be integrated into the faculty side of a law school. And I totally learned that through the Bigelow. The workshopping that you get to do as a fellow, particularly in the Bigelow, was, I think, critical to my success. I don't think I'd be where I am if I didn't do the Bigelow.
And to the extent you can say, what is it that you learned? I mean, is it the style of workshopping? Was it a substantive point? Kind of, it's always hard to unpack what it was exactly that
Yeah.
helped us from an experience. But
Yeah.
just
So
break it down, like what was it?
some of this may be Chicago in particular, but so it is an opportunity for you to get to know law faculty as colleagues. And no matter how close you are to law faculty when you're in law school, you're still in the sort of student posture with those people. I was coming off of a doctorate. I was talking about being an academic. I was as close as you could be to sort of trying it out, but there's nothing like actually being seen as a colleague, which means when it comes time to support you or write recommendation letters for you, those people view you in just like a very different way than they would have if you had been their star student. That's just different than I've read early drafts and she's commented on my work and we're sort of peers in some loose sense. So that kind of relationship was important. And then, yeah, you know, I don't know I guess if you had been maybe in economics, you might not feel this way, but most other disciplines don't workshop the way law schools workshop. Certainly not the way Chicago workshops. And so it's a learned skill. And, at Chicago, you become Teflon, but like learning to do that and to find that engagement rewarding and generative as opposed to like totally depressing is an important thing to learn how to do. And I came to really love it and to see what it was like and to see what good answers were and what evasive answers were. That's all incredibly good prep for going on the job market.
Did you feel that there's like a substantive body of knowledge that comes with that, like certain kinds of arguments? And this reminds me of the discussion over whether like Yale has its PhD in law program. And I remember when it came out, when it was first introduced, there was a lot of criticism of it, like, oh, this is so silly. There is no sort of PhD material that you need to learn in law. And then, of course, the people that have done this program have had fabulous success on the teaching market. Whether they were great when they started or they became great because of the program, I don't know. But there are a lot of terrific people, and it does raise this question of like, is there a body of law that you learn in a VAP, or a body of kinds of arguments that you kind of need the VAP, or at least it's really helpful to have the VAP to learn, that is kind of a big part of the value? And if so, like, what is that body of law so that everybody can know kind of what it is?
Yeah. So, when I went to law school after doing a doctorate, I wondered, like, when do we take the canon? Like, when's the sort of core must know these legal ideas class? Chicago actually has a class called Elements that's something approaching that for its 1Ls. But for the most part, law schools don't assume that their students want to become law professors. We're actually training for something else. And so like making everyone read the path of the law is not like step one in most law schools. So I think the answer is yes. I think there's probably a different sense of the canon at different places. So at Chicago, you learn public choice in a way that you might not if you did a VAP elsewhere. But knowing the sort of core methodologies, the core reference points that get made, at least by people in your field. So in my case, the public law people, when they were workshopping, had a kind of set of things that everybody, in crim, everybody's talking about pathological politics and Bill Stein. So if you don't know that, you're sort of missing a touch point. So I suppose it's actually just seeing the people in your field talking about these sort of classics over and over again. But I think that becomes a way to kind of signal that you know what you're talking about and that you understand the kind of history of the discipline into which you're entering. So it may be specific to your field, but you'll get it. If you watch 30 workshops, you end up getting that kind of canon that comes out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It reminds me a little bit when I was on the teaching market and I had no such preparation, right? This was in the old days when I was at my job and I just applied through the AALS, and I remember I was at the Justice Department and my office neighbor was like the deputy chief of the section, and he could clearly hear me through the very thin DOJ walls as I was talking to various appointments committees. It was incredibly awkward.
Right, you needed a VAP.
I could have used a VAP. And I just remember interviewing. There are still some questions that I received, that 20 years later in my ALS interviews, I'm like, I still don't quite understand what that question was driving at, or there was some phrase or sort of pre-assumed knowledge. And so it does seem that it's valuable to get that, as you say, sort of these arguments that are going to come up a lot, and I take your point, they're going to vary a little bit. At Chicago, it's going to be different from some other places. I also found that out when I visited in Chicago and realized I don't know any of their reference points, and I learned them. But I guess, like, could this be reduced to a book, like a pamphlet of here are the things you need to know, or is it really kind of the kind of knowledge that you just need to be there and encounter it live?
So I think the canon of like, here's what you need to read could be, and actually that should exist. There should be a sort of like, there is a canonical ideas, like the Kennedy book. I mean, anyway, yes, you could do the thinking and the reading, but there's also this like methodological education about the moves. So it's funny you mentioned the question where you have no idea what they're asking. What you do in the face of that is a thing you learn by watching people do it. So the question starts and like, no one knows what it means, and you think like, what am I going to do with this pitch that's like wobbly and over here? And so the watching of workshops by other people who do it well is, I think, irreplaceable. I also will say at Chicago, and this may not be true everywhere, I watched a lot of job talks, and that was like incredibly, and probably the most useful thing I got to do was see a bunch of people come through doing their job talks and then see afterwards what happened and what people thought. It's really useful when you're trying to figure out what is this strange hour-long thing that's going to decide my fate. So probably some of the interpersonal stuff and the how do you handle curveballs stuff can't be replicated. But I actually think there's a place for sort of a core ideas canon repository for people who are interested in going on the market. That should be a pamphlet. We should make that pamphlet.
Yeah, I remember Ward Farnsworth, now dean at Texas, has a book that is kind of that. I think it's sort of based on the Chicago 1L fundamentals thing. It's sort of, here are these recurring arguments. And I recommend that book. I forget exactly what it's called, like The Legal Analyst or something like that. That is kind of an introduction to all of these ideas. And I remember seeing this years later thinking, wow, this would have been incredible, valuable to have at the beginning. I think in part because people go through law school and they have such different experiences. There's no, in law school, every professor is teaching their own version of each course, right? And so some students, I remember in just my own, different people had such different things they were learning, maybe the same cases, but very different kind of theories along with the cases. And so that I think would be helpful. Do you
don't know it when you're getting it. Like, you're either getting public choice torts or philosophy of like dignity and collective decision making, and you actually don't know. You just think you're getting torts. So it would be helpful.
Yeah, and then of course you're a summer associate, and then the partner says, "Well, you should look into this," and you're like, "Oh, of course it's a dignity problem," and the partner looks at you like you're crazy.
Oh, yeah. The memo that says like, "What is a tort?" and you get fired immediately.
Yeah. So the Bigelow program is obviously one of the leading, big programs and one of the most successful ones. Do you have thoughts for those that are looking at fellowship programs? They're sort of the set of the most known ones. How should applicants to these programs think about the different options? Is it sort of top one, or it's not worth it, or is it all of them are worth it? I mean, I guess maybe the question is, how do you know when you're applying whether the program you're applying to is going to have that full set of values that come along with it?
Yeah, so I sort of think there are two models of program, and they don't track rankings or anything like that. So how you find this out is a separate question. But there's the sort of room and time to write model, and there's the total integration boot camp model. So Chicago is on the boot camp side of, the benefits of Chicago are, it is the flattest place I've ever been in terms of hierarchy. My office was between Martha Nussbaum and Diane Wood. And that's when you feel like you've made it. When you get this like tiny office in between, you're like, this is cool. And at Chicago, 3 months in, they're like, where's your paper? Where's your paper? And I really benefited from that. Had I been coming off of, so I did a doctorate before law school, and I didn't have a kind of bank of things that I just needed to clean up for the market. If you're really like ready to go, and all you need is the time and the freedom, the models of fellowship where there's much less integration but much less teaching as well might be the way to go. So I think the question to ask yourself is, how much oversight do I want? How much integration and oversight do I want? And once you decide that about yourself, which has to do with sort of where you are in producing your body of scholarship that you need for the market, sorting between the fellowships and then saying, which one I would prioritize exposure to faculty over the name of the fellowship by far. And geography and all the sorts of other things that go into choosing. But I think it's right for you if you have self-assessed about what you need from a fellowship, because they all look the same, but they're quite different, I think, in practice.
And maybe this is too nuts and bolts to even sort of have good takes on, but how do you find out? I mean, if you're applying for these programs, can you
Yeah.
ask them, or how sort of, I love the framework you provide. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. But will schools answer, yes, this is which side of the line we
Like, oh, we'll never talk to you. You'll be in a room and you'll never interact. No, probably not. I think one proxy for that might be how much teaching you do. So some people say don't do a fellowship with a ton of legal writing teaching, which is like the norm of what you teach in these fellowships. I actually think the opposite. But I had been told that going into fellowships. So I think those that do more teaching may line up with those that are more sort of integrated into the life of the school. But that's not one-to-one. There's certainly ones where you do teaching and you're not. I think asking former fellows, just cold emailing someone who had that fellowship and saying, how much integration into the faculty did you have? What kinds, but figuring out the answer to that question either through emailing or through sort of, you can ask in an interview, sort of what's the norm about, are you required to be in residence? Are you required to teach? Those sorts of things are proxies for how much do you expect to be a part of the day-to-day life of the law school. And if you're looking for space because you have your 4 papers and you need to do the footnotes, maybe one that doesn't require teaching and doesn't require you to be in residence is a good fit. So it's not as if there's a good and a bad, but I think those things are proxies for that question about sort of how much am I a part of the law school.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It is striking to me how, um, you know, on the outside they're kind of positions that people have, and then they can have such different meaning on the inside. Whether it's, I think this is true of visiting professors. Some are that really there all the time. Others are just flying in to teach a class 2 days or one day, and then they're out. Like, you need to kind of figure out what you're going to get out of it, and how to do that, and sort of take that on your own when you're the person in that position, it seems.
But once you're in the academy, you ask people at the school and it's collegial. When you're just breaking in, you're right that it's hard to figure it out. So I think finding someone who did that fellowship and emailing them, and if you can find someone who did it in the last, 3 to 5 years, is probably more useful than the very first Bigelow or something like that. But I think that stuff matters. And on the teaching point, I'll just say, I'm a champion of teaching during fellowships, and I got exactly the opposite advice when I was going on the market initially, or when I was choosing, because you come out with a sense of how to teach, a sense of how to deal with things that inevitably come up in the law school classroom. I feel like I'm in my 3rd year of law school teaching, not my first, and that's different. And also a set of teaching evaluations, and that's really helpful on the market, as long as you don't have horrendous teaching evaluations, to be, to go in and say, I know how to do this job and here's the proof of it. I actually think matters on the market. So I'm not one of the people who says like, oh, they're going to bog you down with teaching, it's so terrible.
Great. That's really helpful. I wanted to turn to job talk papers. So for the perspective of the entry level candidate is, of course, they have their package they're going forward with, and they've got their ALS form, and maybe these days probably a VAP or a PhD or something, or both in some cases. And then they've got their paper, and it's sort of the job talk paper takes on this enormous part of the entry level process. It's sort of the thing that everyone looks to. How should people think about coming up with like the ideal job talk paper? What goes into that, and how should people think about figuring out topics for a job talk?
Yeah, so this was one of the strangest things coming from a different discipline, that you're evaluated on a single paper. I mean, people look at your CV, but it's so strange. I told my sister who's a historian, and it was like, what if it's the one bad paper? And it was like, that's really bad then. So, and I also, the like advice most people will give you is just write the thing that you want and be who you are. But I'm too honest to say that. I mean, I was strategic, and one has to be strategic about what you want your calling card to be. So there's a couple things I would say. One is it has to be something you want to talk about for a year. Because if you hate it, I mean, you will come to hate it by the end of the process, no matter what, but it has to be something that you're genuinely interested in. I think even more than something that's one-to-one representative of all the work you expect to do, something that you want to talk about a lot. I also think if you've got a paper that can bring in people from different disciplines within the legal academy, you will end up faring better. So my job talk paper was about citizenship, race, and segregation and prisons. Those would be my like tag words. Everybody has something that they think about those topics, even if they're not in crim or they're not in immigration. And so I was able to kind of, I think, bring in the IP person. And obviously in certain fields that are more technical, that's harder to do. But if you can present your paper in a way that appeals, the strange thing about both the Legal Academy and the Job Talk is that it's a kind of generalist performance where you have to appeal to people who know nothing about what you're talking about. And so a paper that that is the less technical of the papers you have and the sort of more generalist, more sort of headline interesting might actually, I think, be the one to choose if you're sitting there looking at a whole series of them. And then I will also say, this is a point of debate, I think a paper with a normative punch to it ends up being more fun, even if you're not a sort of normative thinker. This is, historians will be like, I don't do that. I don't do presentist work. Like, I'm just not doing that. In which case, don't do that. But if you have a kind of piece that's more normative and one that's less, I think the normative aspect of a law review paper can bring in people. Because they'll say, like, I don't really know anything about the first 70 pages, but this proposal to abolish the legislature, that's interesting. And then people come in. So I think normative and generalist are the two sort of pieces of advice I would give.
That's, I think, great advice. And I saw your job talk paper delivered, and you were fantastic. And it was a huge success. I mean, so it's a fantastic article. But I think it's a great idea, sort of trying to even think through who's going to be who in a generalist audience will find this appealing. Just thinking through that I think is brilliant. It's a great idea. Does that suggest that you sort of aim for the kind of paper that will be appealing to people? Like, you don't want to cut across the grain too much?
Oh, I was actually going to say appealing or appalling. I don't actually think that's the concern. I think the worst thing that can happen is like 4 questions and no one has more to say. This may have be a result of having been trained at Chicago, where people disagreeing is like not at all a problem. But my sense is that you can, and I don't mean you have to be sort of purposely provocative, because that's not what one should do, but I don't think people have to agree with what you're saying. And I don't think you should pick the topic that is generally appealing such that you don't offend, well, you shouldn't offend anyone, but so that nobody disagrees with the thesis. I think it's more thinking about avoiding highly technical arguments or avoid sort of having a kind of self-referential conversation that isn't going to be something that somebody outside your field can understand. That's in part just about how you present whatever the paper is too. I'm merging into kind of job talk presentation, because you can have a highly technical underlying paper, but it has to be something that you can present to me in crim and I can talk to you about it, notwithstanding the fact that it's about trust and estates.
Yeah, it does seem that the job talks, and probably more entry level job talks than lateral job talks, are these moments where everyone's sort of watching to see who is this person. And it's weird, as you say, like, that's an incredibly odd way of doing it. But the more you can kind of appeal to all these different audience members and bring them in and get them interested, it's almost like you're at a conversation at, some sort of happy hour or something like that, and it's like, who can be the engaging person that brings them in with a topic that sort of appeals to all these different types of people. Then the classic reaction that people have in a talk, especially, maybe they've read the paper, maybe they haven't, is like, how does this relate to my work? And how does this, I'm thinking of these issues, talk to me. And if you can do that through the topic selection, that sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, I've told people who've asked me about the job talk that it's actually, the first part is about proving that you can teach. And then the Q&A is about the kind of specialist, I can play the ball game within the legal academy, sort of intellectual part of things. I sort of think they're two different exercises. And the first part is just, can you be engaging to an audience who knows nothing about this? And then the second part is the crim person who asks the crim question, and you really need to know that the references are right. Or the question like, how does this relate to the study of starfish? And you just like wing it.
That's where your Bigelow learning comes in, right?
You're like, well, starfish in prison, and then you keep going.
Awesome. And you're early in your career, although you've done so much. I mean, you had a book that I guess came out when you were in the year you graduated from law school. Obviously, that's an unusual situation. But how should you think about sort of building from the job talk other works? Sort of, do you think the best way to do it is when you first think about becoming a law professor, start sort of thinking of the research agenda and building the pieces then, or can you be more free to find interesting topics and kind of go wherever you go and see where it takes you?
Yeah, I mean, something I learned at Chicago, which I now do, is I just have a Word document that I keep open of ideas as they come. Some of which are a sentence, some of which are a title, some of which are a paragraph, and just sort of banking ideas as they come across your mind. So if you're thinking about going on the market, starting that now, and then trying to turn that ultimately in practice turned into my research agenda. I actually think of all the things you create for the market, the research agenda is the single most important and actually most useful. Because it's like sort of here's my path to tenure is the way people talk about it, which is oppressive, but sort of here's the set of things I find interesting and where I might go. So I would say trying to create something like the ingredients for a research agenda in a really casual way as you kind of proceed through thinking about this ultimately turns out to be really useful when the time comes to do it. But also, I look back at that document and think, oh, that paper actually was an interesting idea, or that's terrible, or, so sort of banking ideas and not thinking of yourself as in some kind of contract to write any of them, but to kind of, and that may well be what you do now with ideas about what papers you're going to write later in your career, but certainly early career, sort of just keeping the ideas somewhere and keeping that sort of flowing.
In your case, I gather that you sort of had a set of issues that you were interested in pretty early on. I mean, you wrote your book that came out, your last year of law school or around then, is on prisons, and you then end up doing these really interesting articles after law school, also on the topic of prisons. For those that are sort of struggling to figure out what topics to write on that may not have kind of a particular subject that they're sort of intrinsically, into, do you have advice on how to figure that out?
Yeah. I think there's sort of two ways to do it. You either have a thing that makes you wake up in the morning and has made you angry for a really long time and it's a topic, or you might be driven by your method. So, you might be an economist or a historian or a sociologist or a psychologist who's less driven by asking questions about one thing, but who's really interested in, the way people's psychology works across a range of things. So I would say, figure out what it is, whether you're a methods person or a topic person, not that you can't be both. And then if you're sort of thinking about that, start reading in the field. So, if you think I'm really a sociologist, read like the sociology of punishment, the sociology of, the stuff that's being published in the legal academy and in law review journals in particular that has a sociological method and see what sort of inspires you to keep going. So I don't think it has to be a particular topic. Like I knew I wanted to study dogs since I was 7. That's like, unreasonable. But I think a method could also drive your work.
Great. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the the steps that you go through in order to get ready to go on the market. So it can take years, and I gather you clerked for 2 years, and you were Bigelow for 2 years, and you've seen others who've also been preparing for the market, and done been highly successful. It takes several years, it seems like, to really sort of get ready for that moment when you go on the entry level market, and that puts a lot of demands on people, both financial demands. They need to make, some will have the resources for that, some won't, and that's just not an option. And then also family demands, or sort of requiring being certain places. You have to move to a place in order to be the fellow, or VAP there. That's a lot of demands, for the system to put on people, and some will be able to deal with that, and some won't. Do you have thoughts on how candidates should think through? Is it worth it to put that number of years in? Is it worth it to make those sacrifices, which are required in order to just even go on the entry level market after all those years are over?
Yeah, and it's turned into kind of an arms race where like you can have the clerkship and the fellowship and the PhD, and the best is all three. And so you might as well be 45 when you start. It's kind of absurd. And also, as you say and mention, it filters out, it has disparate effects. I mean, it filters out women, it filters out all sorts of people who can't afford to wait until they're 33 to have a job that pays an amount of money that would make it feasible for them to live. I think a couple things. My sense is that of those potential gold stars that one could try to accumulate, that clerking, while I loved it and I learned a lot from it, may be receding in import. And that either a PhD or a fellowship are becoming increasingly important relative to the question of clerking. I think the old school model of a fine young man who did an excellent job in his clerkship may be disappearing, and I meant it the way I said it. I think that, which isn't to say skip clerking, but if you're like, look, I have 2 years, what do I do with it? And if you really want to be a legal academic, I might say fellowship over clerkship. Which isn't to say clerking is interesting on all different levels, but maybe that one's not as important as it used to be. And I think also just thinking about, the other thing is, this is a really great job. So if you can do it, waiting to do it, I think is worth it. And I found it really scary to take the risk. I had this sense that I could have put all of this energy into a job I didn't get, and start as like a first year at a law firm at 34, and it was not going to be the dream. And I think that deters a lot of people who might otherwise want to do it. But it's a really, really good job if you can get it. And remembering that it's unusual to like your job this much, I think can motivate you to kind of keep going. But also on a more sort of pragmatic note, not all of these things are required. A PhD is not required. None of the things I mentioned is required. And thinking about which one's the best fit for you is probably the way to start.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think you're right in pointing out the importance of the idea that it's not all of this is required, and I think there's a stereotype that sort of the person who they clerked for this, clerk in the Supreme Court, have a PhD. There's like 2 people every year on the market that have actually checked every one of those boxes.
Yeah, and they may not get a job.
Yeah, and then most have not, and so perfection is not necessarily the goal, but it does seem that there's been a trade-off over the last 20 years. So let me just compare when I was on the teaching market.
Yeah.
As I'd mentioned earlier, I was just at my job at the Justice Department, and people did not do fellowships typically at the time, and I was writing at night after practicing during the day, and I could do it because it was a government job and it wasn't sort of law firm hours, but that was still an era when you could sort of quietly go on the market. You didn't have to show on your resume like, I'm leaving the firm to become a VAP, and then as you point out, like if you become a VAP for 2 years and it doesn't work out, then you kind of have to go back, and that's really awkward to try to reconfigure that, and that's a real cost that is part of that process. And there's a trade-off then of people being more prepared when they go on the market, and sort of the standards in legal academia being higher, and the cost and sort of narrowing the group of people that are willing to take all that risk. And I know I've heard from those that have gone through this process, it didn't work out, and then they're kind of like, now what? And then you can tell people maybe try again because you've invested all of this, but it's sort of that's a really hard situation to be in. And do you
Yeah.
have thoughts on how you can know at the outset which group, is it going to be worth it? Is, I think, this really big question that people are
Yeah.
asking, and how can you
So,
tell if it's going to be worth it in your case?
well, one thing I was thinking as you were talking is that it's an argument for applying to a fellowship because that's not as onerous as going on the job market. That you can do from your job. And because you don't need your full job talk paper, you just need sort of to apply. And typically it's a proposal about what you'll do there that's a couple pages. And that might, I'm hesitating because I don't want to say if you don't get a fellowship, you won't end up. But if you're really risk averse and you think I'm only going to do this if it's going to work out, one sort of dip your toe in way to figure out if you could enter the academy is to try to enter a legal teaching fellowship in which you have to prove you would ultimately be a sort of helpful member of the academy, and use that as a sort of low cost way to figure out if you could enter. Because if you go and if people are like really elated about your ideas, it's a good signal that you've got something to offer. And if you can't think about what you would even want to do during a fellowship, you probably are not in a position to. So maybe using fellowship applications, which are way lower cost, as a way to kind of try. You don't even have to do the fellowship. They'll be mad at me about all the people who don't do it. But like trying to think about that as a way to get into it. But whether or not it's worth it it's a really hard question. I was a person, I think, I don't know, maybe you tell me if I'm right. I think a lot of people don't feel like they want to do anything else but this. I was like, I want to write in a room alone and teach. That's really who I am. And, I thought a little bit about becoming a public interest lawyer, and I did a lot of clinical work in law school to try those shoes on. But this felt like if I could make this work, this is really the dream. And I think if you have that sense, you should listen to it.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right that there are a lot of people for whom that just I mean, it's a crazy great job. It's sort of amazing this job even exists. And so I think there are enough people that feel that way that if you don't feel that way, it's probably a signal as to maybe that's not the right thing for you. And those who do feel that way are going to just say, listen, this is the moment to try. It's just those that aren't sure it's going to work out do have this really fair question. How do you sort of play your cards in a way that if it doesn't work out, you can come back, especially because, and sort of looking at the current market, the pandemic has hit and it's going to impact hiring in some ways. We don't know in what way, but you never know the moment, the year you come on the market, whether that'll be a good hiring year or a terrible hiring year. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty that people have to grapple with. And
I also think you could ask someone, like some professor of yours will be honest with you. Assess who would be honest with you. But, saying, is this a good fit? One thing I wanted to say is there's a really big difference between being a good law student and being a good academic. And often that's not clear. When you're in law school and you're doing well in law school, you might think that means I should do this, but in fact, it may not. So maybe, yeah, applying for fellowships as a way to sort of see if you can get over that hump, but also just being honest and asking the professors that you admire whether this seems like something that you could do. I don't know, it's hard to tell someone no to that, but if you frame it the right way, I actually think someone might say, this is a total crapshoot and you got to have a lot more in your resume in order to really do this. If you get that kind of a signal back from your mentors, it may be telling as well. So I think candor and asking people is also valuable.
great. We've talked a little bit about the financial burdens of taking this long path to sort of getting ready and ideally prepping yourself for the market. There's also the personal questions that everybody will have to figure out of, can I move to the place where the VAP is, or can I move to where the ultimate tenure track position is. People have to sort of figure out their life situation. They may have partners that are, it's a dual career family. Increasingly, that's what's going on, and then they're going to have to deal with questions of children and all these life questions. You know are do you think schools are aware of these challenges and are dealing with them? Is there anything that the schools can do to sort of be more aware of those life questions? In part, I think because 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, it was not an issue. This is going back to your like a fine gentleman who did well in his clerkship or something like Dean Griswold would say, "Aha, you clerked for Justice Harlan. Justice Harlan says you're great. Come aboard." And then the guy comes aboard with his wife who raises the children. That was sort of the model where schools just ignored all this stuff, and obviously that's not the case today. And what can schools do better, or are schools doing as well as they can, sort of in thinking through these sorts of problems?
No. I think so. One thing I hadn't thought I would say, but now I think I will, is I think it's incumbent upon law professors to reach out to students, particularly women and people of color and people that get filtered out through all of the demands that you're talking about, if you think they have promise. I mean, I think actually this kind of mentoring of 1Ls or 2Ls who you think actually should write a note to see if they like writing a note, this kind of cultivating of it early might actually really matter. Because for someone who hadn't been thinking about it, I thought I was going to go be a sociologist and instead decided to add a law degree, which is why I looked so like ready by the time I did it. It was because I sort of took a turn toward law school late. But if you were, 24 and in law school and someone said, "Hey, you should really think about this," that could be hugely significant in changing the course of how you went through law school. So I think, students who want to be in academic type programs or committees and sort of identifying students early is one thing law schools can do at the front end to ensure that you don't have people who are 35 that just can't think about it now. And then, maybe to undo everything I've said, changing the model of hiring would change this. So not requiring a fully complete job talk paper and not requiring a resume that looked the way we want resumes to look. I mean, you could imagine, I guess there's a smaller answer and a bigger answer. And the bigger, more structural answer is it's very strange to hire someone who has to be like perfectly ready at the perfect moment, as opposed to just evaluating someone more holistically. And that might actually help for the people who can't take off the time to go move their spouse to somewhere else for 2 years. And that, of course, disproportionately affects women and, lots of groups, but I'm thinking particularly about women, because the model of sort of bringing along your partner, in a heterosexual couple with a woman and a man, it is more likely that the man can bring his partner than the other way around. And that shows up in schools, where I think actually what that ends up doing is pushing women in this profession towards schools in cities. So I think it will be, if you sort of projected this out over time, I think it might be harder and harder, pandemic notwithstanding, because if everyone's working remotely, this might change. But
it all works in Zoom.
Schools not in cities are going to have I think, a harder time recruiting women who are married to men, or who are, in relationships with men. Because I think it's harder to get them to follow. This is like talking, 10,000 feet. I have a really terrific spouse who went wherever I wanted after much conversation. I mean, that matters. Having someone who's willing to move. And I actually think if there is a rise in remote work, this could have a positive effect.
Oh, really interesting. Yeah.
My husband works remotely. So his job is based in Northern California, and he was able to go to the school that I ended up choosing to go to because he was able to work remotely.
Okay. Yeah, and I think this is a major shift that schools are grappling with. That switch from the typically male hire who was able to sort of bring a family along to dual career families, where that I think has made a major impact on schools, with some schools benefiting, as you say, the ones in cities, the ones when I was in DC at GW, that was a big selling point of
Sure.
GW, right? We say we're in downtown DC. This is great for partners, and this is a great place to be, especially in law, which a lot of lawyers marry lawyers, and so that's an advantage there, and then a disadvantage at other schools that are less centrally located. And I've noticed that it's more likely, for example, for schools that are not in cities to have to hire couples,
Both academics, yeah.
both academics, or find a position for the non-academic partner somewhere in the university. And it's sort of, I assume, just they kind of have to in order to be able to be appealing for academics that have a lot of options. But that, I think, is a really significant structural change that schools are grappling with, and I just don't know if they've sort of figured it out yet, or there's still a long way to go.
No, I think it's hard, and I think it's a barrier to recruiting. I'll speak about women, but I suspect it's broader groups of people. It's a barrier to recruiting women um, overall. These kind of entrenched dynamics about two dual spouse couples.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's next? I'm interested to know, to the extent you can say, kind of where your research agenda is taking you, the next article or articles, or what's kind of planned.
Yeah, well, so I tend to have a kind of front burner and a back burner. The front burner is stuff that can be written without FOIA. My methodology, my background is in ethnography and in actually being able to go into penal institutions. It's impossible in the United States. It's super impossible during a pandemic. And so I tend to use FOIA a lot to find out information about what's going on inside custodial institutions. That is not a method that aligns with a really productive research agenda pre-tenure because it takes a year to get all of that. So I tend to have back burner FOIA projects and then front burner doctrinal or theoretical projects. So I'm writing, I'm doing a long-term study of the economics of prisons, and in particular, just the cost of running prisons. So we don't actually have a sense of how much it costs to run prisons state by state. So I'm doing a 50-state study of what would it mean to, well, you could think about it as what would it mean to divest from prisons, but also just the real sort of frame is prisons are operating as mini welfare states, and we don't have our head wrapped around just how much prisons are supporting. So how much are they spending on sort of jobs for correctional officers, healthcare inside prison? So trying to grapple with the full scope of our spending on prisons is a long-term project I'm working on. And in the nearer term, I'm working on projects on private prosecution. And I have a project about how pathological the dynamics of prison doctrine are, because I wanted to write just like a doctrinal prison paper. So, and then I have a couple citizenship ones. This is your list that you have going, but right now it's the FOIA paper and the private prosecution paper will be in the hopper next. And when next is a different question we can talk about.
Great. Well, I think we're just about out of time, but I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been incredibly helpful, and I'm a big fan of your work. I look forward to all of it coming down the pike, and thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for asking me. It's good to talk to you.